standing order at the local library for any book that had jazz in the title. So it was just carte blanche, anything, big band, jazz, anything at all. I just went through the whole catalog and just ordered them all.
Phil Dwyer is a Juno award-winning jazz saxophonist, composer, pianist, and teacher whose widely varied career took him from humble beginnings living on a floating lumber raft as a child to the jazz haunts of New York City, playing with some of the giants of the genre. We met him in Qualicum Beach on Vancouver Island.
Phil, I wanted to start by asking you a little bit about your childhood, because you grew up in a truly unique environment. I mean, I don't think I've ever met anybody who could say they grew up in some place that was just floating around, but that's what it was, right?
That's right. In the, in those days in the 60s, there were lots of prime locations for logging up and down the coast where there was, lots of great timber, but
right.
Not necessarily a large enough flat spot to build a camp. And so what they would do was to have these huge floats and put the houses on the floats, and basically most of the buildings, they would have the equipment sheds and stuff,
right,
maybe on the land, but where people lived was all on huge floats, and they would move into an area and log that area, and when the logging was done, they'd just get a couple of tugboats and tow the whole operation.
Okay, because I was trying to imagine how it would be moved around.
Yeah.
So when you're talking huge, like how big are we talking here?
Well, you can imagine I was really young when we lived there, but there must have been maybe 25, 30 families.
Wow.
Living, and everybody had, there were a certain number of families, and there'd be large bunkhouses where the single men.
And what was the accommodation, like what was your house like? It was like a normal house?
It was like a small, normal house. Yeah, it was like just take a house and stick it on a large log boom, basically.
How peculiar. I mean, I guess if it's the only thing you knew, it wouldn't be that peculiar, but maybe it was peculiar when you got to land and had to...
Well, maybe it was. I was just my family had been a product of the logging business in British Columbia for many generations, going back to the late 1800s in the Cowichan Valley, where when
so
my
real
family
tradition there.
Settled, between the 1860s and 1880s, they all sort of converged on the Cowichan Valley. So my grandfather logged in Lake Cowichan, and they lived in float camps, and it was kind of a family tradition up till the point where we struck out for solid land.
Okay, so one would think, and I remember when I first read that you'd done that, I thought, well, if you're in that kind of an environment as a kid, how do you get exposed to music? How did you get exposed to music?
Well, I was, like you say, you don't know any different, so you assume that everybody has it like that. I was just blessed to be raised in a family where music was a real priority.
Right.
And my dad was a great logger, but in a lot of ways he was a frustrated intellectual who I think if he'd have pursued a career in English or music or whatever, he was very gifted intellectually, and had amazing ability to retain information about literature and music. And he had a fairly, it was not a large but very well selected collection of music on 45s, 78s, and at a certain point he transferred most of it onto reel-to-reel. Quarter-inch reel-to-reel, which was in those days a popular format. And in fact, I believe he bought his reel-to-reel tape from a traveling salesman, if you could believe it, traveled up and down the coast on a boat. He was a Jewish merchant. His name was Ted Goldblum, and he used to ply his wares up and down at all these little camps up and down the coast, selling electronic equipment and books and recordings and whatnot. And
really?
my dad had, and the story was that he was actually a friend of Isaac Stern's, the great violinist, and he would stop and spend a day or two at my dad's camp, and they would sit together and maybe have a glass of scotch and listen to recordings of Isaac Stern and Yehudi Menuhin and all the great violinists. And my dad said that old Ted would sit there and at the peak of some of these musical pieces, he would have a tear going down his face. And you know, he came from a European lineage, and it somehow ended up on the coast. And so anyways, you know, through the years, he collected you know, a lot of classical recordings, a lot of you know, classic recordings with Bernstein and the New York Phil and Oscar Peterson and George Shearing, a lot of Shearing, a lot of Louis Armstrong, and then all his old collection of 78s, which he had meticulously transcribed onto reel-to-reel tape by sitting in front of the 78 player with the two microphones.
The microphones, yes, okay. That's how you had to do it.
Yeah, that's right. And
nothing was hardwired.
And he recorded, in order to be frugal, he recorded everything at the slowest possible speed.
Great.
Which was, I think, 1 and
7/8. 1 and 7/8.
1 and 7/8 inches per second. And so, not good for fidelity, but in terms of archival, you know, the amount of material you could get onto a reel, it was phenomenal. So for every reel of tape, there would be a stack of handwritten notes, and he transcribed every last...
All the liner notes?
Every last word off of... Not liner notes. I don't know if there were so many liner notes on 78s, but recording dates and all the information about where it was recorded and all the sidemen. And so I was growing up, you know, reading names like, you know, Peanuts Hucko and Big Sid Catlett, and I was up in the middle of nowhere just as I was just learning to read, you know, basically, and listening to all that music.
So, but it was, I guess, if there was one of those epiphanies that you had, or that Rosicrucian moment of insight about music, it was jazz as opposed to classical, was it not for you?
That was the real epiphany I had was the Duke Ellington Orchestra. That was my moment where my life made sense. I knew, and that was a little later on. But you know, but by the time that I really had that, really felt that connection that with the music, I already had an extensive you know, history of listening to
and you've been taking lessons, music lessons as well,
and
right?
I'd started taking music lessons. That was after we moved into a town.
Into a real town.
Into a real town,
So did you, I mean, you mentioned earlier that your father had this great sense of retention of the musical retention and sort of factual retention as well, and it's something that you inherited as well, right? And you have an ability to retain all of that stuff.
Apparently, yeah. And I didn't, you know, once again, you know, if you only have yourself as a reference point, or you don't, it's hard to really make an accurate assessment of what's going on.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
So it actually, I mean, I always knew I had a good retention, but it wasn't until I saw my son sort of kind of demonstrating those same kind of skills that it dawned on me, because I'd worked with a lot of young people, and I'm always was trying to understand how things connected for them or didn't connect for them, and then all of a sudden I had this, you know, he was maybe 15 or 14 or 15 at the time, young fellow who could remember anything that he heard, and then I thought, well, I can too, and I started to realize what a huge advantage that was in being a musician, like just having that catalog of sounds in your brain.
So was the saxophone the first instrument you were interested in, or how did that develop?
Well, I started off as a piano player, doing the regular Royal Conservatory thing, which I followed through to grade 9. So up to the point where I was playing Beethoven sonatas and that kind of music.
All right.
But when I just discovered Duke Ellington, it was the saxophone players that really tweaked my interest.
Yeah.
My dad was a real trumpet guy. He was really into Ray Nance and Cootie Williams and all the guys that played with Duke. But but I heard Johnny Hodges and,
Okay,
and
yeah.
Ben Webster, and then I had a standing order at the local library for any book that had jazz in the title.
Okay.
So it was just carte blanche, anything, big band, jazz, anything at all. I just went through the whole catalog and just ordered them all. So they would sort of rotate in, through the local library
Right.
system, and I, the picture, I think it was a picture of Ben Webster holding his tenor, and he probably had a cool hat on and a snappy suit, but just the way the light came off of the horn, it just looked amazing to me, and so that was kind of where I headed when school band
Yeah.
became an option for me.
Okay, so you would have been at what age then?
12.
12.
Yeah.
So between the time you're 12 and the time you're what, 17? So in like 5 short years, you go from thinking, gee, I'd like to play that tenor sax, to being in New York City, playing with some of the guys whose names you were reading, essentially, in the transcriptions that your father had made.
Yeah, crazy.
How the hell did that happen?
I don't know. It's it's really hard to imagine how that happened. I mean, I know that I was just so passionate about it that I almost thought about nothing else.
Yeah.
Really, I'm surprised I even graduated from high school because I was so obsessed with developing this craft. And
did you spend a lot of time every day playing, practicing?
I did, yeah, every day. I don't think I missed a day.
Wow.
Probably for those 5 years.
Okay.
And I always had the knack of interjecting myself into into meeting people that
Okay.
could help me.
Okay. All right. That's a skill a lot of people don't have. So,
Somehow or
yeah.
other, and I don't know. I mean, my parents were both very gifted socially. They were they're very both outgoing, both very smart, and attracted a wide circle of interesting people from
Right.
all walks of life. And so I guess I saw them, in action, doing that, like where they would just kind of search out people that were interesting and try to just figure out how they ticked. And so I did that quite naturally. And so at a very young age, it felt natural to me if I saw there was an opportunity to get close to somebody that had something that I wanted to learn,
Yeah.
I would really seize it.
Yeah. And would you say, because a lot of people don't do this, but the people that my experience has always been in talking to people who become very good at what they do, is that they had no compunction to ask those people that they idolized in a lot of ways, how do you do that? It seems to be the simplest question in the world that hardly ever gets asked, but some people ask it, and I'm assuming you did.
That's all I did. and I could never figure out why more people didn't do that, because it seemed to me to be the most natural thing. And by doing that, I was able to, achieve huge leaps of knowledge in what amounted to maybe like it could be a 2 or 3 minute conversation.
Yeah. And a lot of these people, once you ask that, people tend to be very amenable in telling you what it is they're doing and how they do it. Right? Was that your experience?
Absolutely, especially if you can frame it in a somewhat specific.
Right.
So but even it could be even not specific. I was on a recording session with pianist and arranger Jimmy Dale, who used to be the musical director for the Sonny and Cher show back in the 70s, and he was a fixture on the Toronto scene with the Boss Brass and lots of recording, television stuff, and a very, very gifted writer. And we were on we were on a recording session together that he had arranged. And I was just getting into writing, and I was kind of looking over his shoulder at the score and checking it out. And he turned around to me and said, "Are you interested in arranging?" And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "Okay, well, what you got to remember is that these are musical terms. The overtone series, all your chords have to match that." And I said, "Okay." And then he said, "And use contrary motion at every possible opportunity." And I said, "Okay."
Okay. If you know what these things are.
And, well, as an example, so how long did that take? 30 seconds?
Yeah.
I've used that advice in every arrangement I've ever written.
Wow.
And it's foolproof.
Yeah.
If you observe those two rules, everything else falls into place. And so my education has been just moments like that, strung together over the last 30, 35 years.
Tell me about the New York milieu. You're a young guy, you're down there, you're surrounded by and in the presence of all of these guys that you admire. What was that like for you?
Well, I was lucky that I was naive and young enough that I didn't really know any better in a lot of ways. I didn't realize how...
You didn't know enough to be intimidated?
How much I didn't belong there. But the funny thing was when I always, you always assume that when you're young, you didn't know anything and you've learned so much in the meantime. Now, as far as actually playing the saxophone goes, I was actually pretty good. I kind of did belong there in a way. I mean, I was really young, obviously, but I've heard recordings that just bootleg recordings of things that I was playing on with those guys at the time, and it wasn't incongruous.
Yeah.
I mean, there was so I think that I had so little doubt that was what I was meant to be doing, that I just sort of rolled with it. And whatever happened, it just sort of it seemed.
I have to ask you: is it when you listen to a recording of yourself playing back then? Is it sort of like somebody looking at a photograph of themselves when they're young and going, "Gee, was that really me?" When you hear yourself playing music from like decades ago, do you go, "Wow, listen to me"? Is there?
Well, I'm a lot of times I'm pleasantly surprised.
Good.
Because you don't want to. I was earlier in your career. You're out there. You're representing yourself as a professional, and you hope you're doing a good job. And so, I go back and hear recordings that I might have made when I was in my early 20s, and pleasantly surprised.
Yeah.
I'm also kind of chagrined at how little progress I've made since. In some ways, in other ways, it's been a huge amount of growth. But in actual physical ability to play the instrument, I mean, there definitely are advantages to youth in terms of that kind of stamina and just that kind of fire in your belly sort of approach. But you have to learn also to be kind to yourself, and that's one of the biggest lessons to learn.
I got to ask you, because you have talked about this, but you also this is when drugs came into your life. Mm-hmm. You were early on. You talked about being in New York and being naive, and I guess that in part that's probably one of the factors that. But you became, like a lot of musicians, fairly heavily involved in drugs, and it was part of your life for quite a while after that, for a couple of decades after that, and you managed to keep it, as you have said in other venues, you managed to keep it hidden from most people.
Yeah, I guess I was like a middle class drug addict, and since that time, as I've sort of embarked upon the healing process of trying to sort all that stuff out, I've learned how when I was 17, when you're in those late teen years, how your brain is essentially wiring itself up, establishing the patterns that you're going to follow for the rest of your life.
So you insert drugs at that moment.
Bad timing.
Bad timing.
Really bad timing.
Yeah.
So that happened, and
but you functioned. You functioned for years and years as a musician and as a family man and as a normal guy for all intents and purposes.
Yeah, I became an expert in judging the level of intoxicants I could put into my body and still maintain a veneer of functionality. Yeah. I mean, and I was functioning. I mean, there was no doubt I was working at a high level. But I think probably the hardest thing for me in dealing with that is dealing with the disappointment of thinking about what I could have done if not. Yeah. And that's what those of us who are in the ongoing process of recovering from an addiction like that, that's one thing you constantly have to fight, is letting go of that sadness, and disappointment of what you could look at it as being a lot of wasted years. But then I look at what I did in those years and I say, how could you look at that as being a waste? I mean, it is what it is. Yes, that's what happened. Yeah. I mean, at the end of the day, where and I hate to use cliches like at the end of the day, but where it all ended up, and looking at what happened and where I ended up, and it'd be hard to imagine how it could be much better in a lot of respects.
Yeah, man, it could have been so much worse for you.
It could have been a lot worse. And it really, there were a lot of times where it was really wobbling on the edge. But having the benefit of being raised in a stable environment, and working, I mean, and having my own family, working in an environment with supportive people that really helped me out a lot. I mean, I was so lucky in that respect that despite having all these problems going on, I had lots of checks and balances that were in place, and I also had a real strong work ethic. I mean, that's what kept me going a lot of the time. I knew that things were really, really going wrong in a lot of parts of my life, but I was always determined that I was going to do a great job when I showed up for work, and that really kept me going, and then of course having the kids and whatnot. I mean, there was always a point beyond which I was unwilling to travel.
Yes, that makes sense.
And that kept me, sort of on the.
So you had, from what I gather from other interviews that you've done, a moment where you decided enough's enough of this. That that was it. You were gonna call it quits and clean it up. And what was that moment like?
It was very clear. At that point, I was binging. I was traveling a lot whenever I left home. When I was at home, I was okay. I was still drinking a bit, but as soon as I would leave home, I was just binging on whatever I could get my hands on, and suffering from blackouts and just getting into situations that were getting really, really more scary. And I just woke up one morning. I'd had a rough couple of days, and I was able for the first time to look at me through somebody else's eyes, and what I saw was really sad and disappointing, and just it was headed towards oblivion, and it became very clear that I had to just stop. Like, that was it, and I had a choice to make, and I made the choice that I felt I had to, and that was about almost exactly 5 years ago now. Yeah. And
wow.
And it's been quite a journey since then. But it's been all very, very positive.
Now, I want to ask you in the last couple of minutes, because now, having gone through all of that and everything, you turn your attention. Now, I've listened to this, I swear I've listened to this at least 20 times in the last several months. Changing Seasons, the violin concerto. You write something, It's just shy of 40 minutes long, I think. It's all one great piece of music for a 17-piece musical group that has violins. All the arranging that you were talking about earlier and those things that you learned in 30 seconds seem to have come into play here.
38 piece, actually.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay. So what made you decide that you would take on something of that magnitude?
Well, for the first time in my life, I realized I could. I realized that I could actually focus on something and carry through with it that I'd never been able to do before. I was able to maintain positivity for long enough to complete a project like that.
Yeah.
Whereas before, I would get bogged down in depression or substance abuse or whatever it was that would prevent me from achieving sort of larger efforts like that.
Yeah.
So that was one of the real benefits of, among many others, the ability to complete a large project like that was a real bonus.
Yeah. I'm still, I listen to it, and for somebody who knows nothing about music other than I know what I like to listen to, that's the extent of it. It astonishes me how people, this applies to any piece of music like this, but the complexity of it and how you manage to put all of that together. And I had this vision of you scribbling on walls and on big pieces of paper, and is that what you do?
Yeah.
Yeah?
That's
Okay.
basically what it is. Maybe not the walls. But
All right.
Yeah, no, it's a bit of a mad scientist kind of an affair. You have to maintain your train of thought for days and days on end, and able to make it cohesive. So yeah, you just basically lock yourself in a room with a bunch of sharp pencils and an urn of coffee and have at her, and it ends up looking like some kind of a mad science experiment.
Yeah.
It was. When I look at what I've done in the last 5 years, the evidence of sobriety
Yes.
and of better mental health and stability it's very obvious to me now.
Yeah.
So
I bet.
so it's been very gratifying, and it really mitigates what I was talking about, the disappointment of what could have happened. Who cares what could have happened, because this is what's happening now, and that's what's exciting, and that's what keeps me going. So.
Yeah. We have run short of time. Congratulations on it. As I say, I've listened to it an awful lot, and I will continue to. It really is a great piece. Thanks a lot, Phil. It's really good to meet you.